Hello and welcome to the Completed Life Initiative's latest symposium, Last Hellos, New Models in Global End-of-Life Care. This symposium asks the question, how do we navigate one of life's most transformative experiences, our dying?
Drawing inspiration from Australian poet Les Murray's observation that these kind of questions summon last hellos. Today's Global Symposium welcomes speakers from Australia to Belgium, the United States to Rwanda, as we explore new models in end-of-life and palliative care.
From the origin of what it means to be palliative in the context of Aboriginal communities, to the scientific inquiry into the effect of placebos, from research into personal narratives of end-of-life visions, to expanding eligibility considerations for medical aid in dying. This two-day symposium invites you to contemplate one of life's most powerful transformative experiences.
Your presence in this virtual space means a lot to us, and we are grateful for you tuning in today. Be sure to stay till the end of this presentation, as there will be an opportunity for you to join a Completed Life Initiative team member and your fellow symposium attendees at our virtual event cafe. Thanks for joining.
Hello, my name is Mark Barger Elliott. I'm the Executive Director of the Completed Life Initiative. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Last Hellos, New Models in Global End-of-Life Care. In this session, our topic is Creating Compassionate Communities from Belgium to Oregon. It's my pleasure and honor to welcome and introduce Elizabeth Johnson. Elizabeth is co-founder and executive director of the Peaceful Presence Project. With a master's degree in community and urban planning, Elizabeth has traveled the globe as an educator and facilitator, awakening her fascination with the cultural and social contexts that shape human understandings of illness, grief, and death. She is a member of the Public Health Palliative Care International Leadership Council, a board member of the Central Oregon Council on Aging. She is a former member of the board of directors of the National End-of-Life Doula Alliance and co-led their Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee. She's passionate about integrating death literacy initiatives in local communities and encouraging honest dialogue around the complexities of the dying process. Welcome, Elizabeth. We are just so delighted that you are joining our symposium.
Thank you, Mark. It's great to be here with you. Appreciate the conversation.
Absolutely. Well, what we're exploring in this global conversation are new ways to approach end-of-life care, from the impact of AI, for example, to how art can enhance the end-of-life process, to indigenous practices. And I wanted to explore with you, with your expertise, the concept of compassion as it applies to end-of-life care, and then more specifically as it applies to community and what are called compassionate communities. So to begin, I'm wondering if you might share how you came to work within the complexities of the dying process. Was there a person, an event, a book that revealed this path to you in your own life?
Great first question. And I would say it's been a pathway of surprises. It's a kind of a meandering of different kind of spontaneous arisings around the experience of being with those around end of life. When I was 21, which was a long time ago, I actually had the opportunity to work with the Sisters of Charity in Calcutta, India, and volunteered at Kaligat, which was a home for individuals who were dying without much care. So, individuals found on train station platforms or out on the street and not really kind of surrounded with cohesive ecosystems of care that were really supporting them. And so they would bring these, mostly women that I worked with, women back to this space. And it was a very basic human encounter of I spoke no Hindi, I didn't have any medical background, and I sat bedside with individuals and held their hands and washed their bodies and did the really very basic caregiving kind of interventions, attempting to communicate to these humans that they mattered and that how they were cared for until that last breath was something that the people around them really wanted to do to the best of their ability. So that experience really opened up for me this question of how do we companion one another intentionally, whether we know someone or we don't, right? Those chance encounters that put us in one another's lives. Fast forward, my about 12 years ago, I was pregnant, had a full-term pregnancy, very healthy pregnancy. And the surprise of all of us, my son had a true knot in his umbilical cord. And so he was born with a lot of physical complications, to the extent that the day after his birth, we had to take him off of life support, and he died in my arms.
Oh.
And that for me was this real experience of all this kind of external, conceptual, theoretical ponderings about how we be with one another around experiences of death and grief really came to the center of my life and opened up for me something, a bigger question around how do we cultivate capacity and competency within communities to do that work with one another better. I found that some people knew how to move towards my grief, towards my very close experience with death, and others had no idea what to do. And so through my master's degree in urban planning, community development, I really started to kind of hold that question from a systems sort of vantage point as well. And that wondering around what does it take to allow communities to be there with one another during these very difficult experiences. And so that kind of the circuitous pathway led me to the work that I'm doing today.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I'm always impressed with people who have, if it's fair to say, a traumatic experience such as you had, or a loss, and then are able to reframe, if that's the right word, or open that experience up to help others. And it feels like somehow you were able to do that.
It's one of those life experiences, right? The crack kind of comes down through the middle of things, and you pause after a lot of grieving, after a lot of immobility, after a lot of falling apart, and there's the question of, and now what, right? What do I do? What do I do with this? What do I do with this different orientation, a different literacy of sorts that comes into your life? And for me, one of those things was to say, I want to sort of shift the narrative or the potential for other people around how we can be cared for during experiences of death, of illness, of grief, etc.
Yeah. I love how you point us to this question of literacy and vocabulary and how that can guide us on these journeys, which is a great segue. What I was hoping we might think through together is this question of compassion. And the word comes from the Latin root passio, which means to suffer, and the Latin prefix con. So literally, compassion means to suffer together. And thinking through that over the last few days, I was reminded how Joan Halifax, the Zen Buddhist teacher, once wrote how the way out of the storm and the mud of suffering and the way back to freedom on the high edge of strength and courage is through the power of compassion. And what does that word mean to you? Have you obviously have given it some thought in your work and life? What might you share with us how compassion, what that means for you in your own life or in your work? Or
Well, I love that you brought Roshi Joan Halifax, and I actually had the gift and the opportunity to do her Being with Dying training at Kaya Zen Center about a year and a half ago or so, and was in Roshi Joan's presence really sitting with this question of what is compassion. And one of the things that Rashida in Halifax also talks about is compassion being the spontaneous arising of the desire to turn towards and make another's suffering somewhat different, somewhat better, that we signal to others around us. There is this sense of we are in this together, and that I see my suffering in you and your suffering in me. I keep for the last 6 months or so, I've been saying that one of my favorite new words is intervulnerability. This understanding that we are all at the essence, we are vulnerable beings. We are the fragility of the breath that we are gifted is something that, I think is an essential practice to hold with us on a daily basis. And then this intervulnerability of recognizing the interdependence, that web of kind of mutuality that inherently connects all of us. And so I think for me, compassion is, remembering that, seeing myself in another. And then, I think for us in our work, the other sort of addition or kind of activation around that is this question of what sort of literacy, competency do we need to add to our own sort of practical wisdom around these spaces of death, of grief, of loss, to be able to be with and then to be resourced in a different way, to feel informed and capable of both coming alongside of someone in their suffering, but then also to sort of be able to kind of map out a potential pathway together of what else might be happening here. And so, yeah, that kind of feeds back into, how I think about the work that we do as an organization in the world too.
Yeah, that's insightful. And what I hear you saying, tell me if this is right, that there is an element in compassion that involves action, which is different than empathy. Empathy is we feel someone's pain, but there's something in compassion that leads you to be vulnerable, as you're putting it. And compassion isn't even kindness necessarily. It's just something unique, which is a great segue to sort of your work. And in the session, I'll share a conversation I had with professor and end-of-life care researcher Luke Deliens, who I know you've met, about how compassion has evolved into being expressed in community. And share with me how perhaps this model captured your attention and how you understand compassion working in a communal context.
I think the real sort of capturing of attention for me with this model happened around, as I said, the experience of losing my son, and with experience, right, culturally, with experiences of loss, of grief, of illness, these spaces where we start to feel apart from others, right? We feel disenfranchised or disconnected from this wider sphere of life that's about being productive, about being active, about being, kind of out in the world in a different way. And when we have these experiences of the cracking, right, the diagnosis, the unexpected death, the grief experience that kind of brings us to our knees, we as communities don't necessarily have the kind of almost mental emotional infrastructure to work with to say, well, and then what do we do for one another in those spaces? And so for me, with my background in urban planning and kind of community design and development, I think that was the part of my both previous educational learnings, life experiences, and then thinking, what sort of organization do we want to create to really start different conversations around the role of community when it comes to these life experiences. The compassionate community model of care, or public health palliative care, or as we've started talking about it as an organization, social model palliative care, social approach palliative care, really served to kind of give us a framework or some guidelines to start thinking about how to put into action the use of that compassionate desire to be engaged on the human level within communities.
I think that's wonderful. And can you give us, from your perspective, what that might look like? So I know, like Luke talks about, so often in today's world, we might live alone, or we might be separated from our family, or so the process of grief or the process of facing a dire or terminal illness isolates us. But there's something about this model that sort of attends to that situation. How have you seen that theoretically or practically work where a compassionate community embraces someone in that situation?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, when you think about the different elements of how to cultivate a compassionate community, one of the essential pieces that really needs to be considered and questioned is, how do you start to educate the public? How do you bring more death and grief literacy into the fabric of a community so that people feel prepared to say, hey, next door neighbor, I know your husband just received a new diagnosis and it's probably scary to you. We want you to know you're not alone in this. And I think for people to be able to do that, we unfortunately just do not have, that kind of the cultural literacy to really intuit how to do that for one another. And one of the things the compassionate communities model of care teaches us is that death and dying are social events with medical components, not medical events with secondary or tertiary social components to it. And so it takes kind of turning that on its head a little bit for us as community members and saying, we all have a responsibility and we are inherently empowered in our humanness to say, the biggest areas where you are going to require support during this challenging experience of illness, of death and dying, and grief, typically 80% of that experience is more psychosocial, emotional, relational, or spiritual in nature. So I think it's about saying to people, there are things we can educate ourselves around to have you feel more comfortable, more competent, more kind of human capacity to move towards those experiences that from the outside look very challenging, from the inside are really challenging, but there's ways of coming into relationship and kind of communion around that really can sort of help to elevate and surround a person's experience so they don't feel alone. And so I have examples of how we've done that as an organization, but I think that, the educational piece is really essential to give people that sense of, oh, right, this includes me as well.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I know people in this work in compassionate communities often point to Professor Alan Kelleher's work, I think a couple decades ago now, who began to identify this model. And like in reading about this, he had a compassionate city charter, which has this lovely idea that a city is not merely a place to work and to access services, but equally a place to enjoy the support in the safety and protection of each other's company, which is such an idealistic way to think about a city. It's a completely different way to think of how we interact in our lives. But what I hear you saying is there's a potential to educate people to embrace this idea of safety and protection and community in a city, in a town, wherever we might live. And that can truly unlock something that's missing in our lives.
Exactly. And I think, part of, I think what it comes back to is when we are in relationship, when we are in community, when we have these wider circles of connectivity around us, we're able to remember in a different way the fullness of who we are, right?
Hmm.
We are not simply a patient with a diagnosis. We are not simply the person who's going for treatment for dot, 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 right? We are allowed to
Right.
be a different, vibrant, dynamic, vital part of the life that we find ourselves within the midst of. And so it allows a different sort of kind of orientation towards wellness, right? That we can be well, we can be connected, we can be seen, we can belong regardless of what we're navigating health wise, illness wise, that there's still this reminder of or a different connection to the totality of who we are, that we don't sort of cinch off that reality. And that's the relational aspect that is so essential, right? We are social beings. I mean, all of this beautiful research coming out around the physical, emotional, mental impacts of social isolation, right? What that does, the detriments of that. And so there's an interesting phenomenon, right, where we navigate the difficult things in life, and then we get put in the room of isolation because most of the world around us does not know how to be with us. We need more than ever, in so many ways, community, relationships, connectivity in those experiences of challenge to remind us of our assets, of our connections, of the places of meaning that really belong, and so that matter, that create a place of belonging for us. And community is so inherently wrapped up in that understanding of ourselves.
I think that's right. And at the completed, what popped in my mind at the completed life initiative, what we're beginning to think through, one, to build that takes a little bit of effort and it takes an invitation. So, for example, one thing we've tried in the last year, we call it CLE at home, completed life initiative at home, uh, living room conversations about what matters most.
Mm.
And so we've started to have a few of these around the country where a group will gather in someone's living room effectively. A few people know each other, but not everyone does. And the idea is to create a sense of safety, like Alan Kelleher talks about, where you can discuss the difficult things in your life, a diagnosis, a grief situation. And we found those very effective and almost a small model of what a compassionate community might be. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, and I love that. I think, Mark, sometimes the daunting uh, reality, or looking and saying, oh my gosh, what would it look like to create a compassionate city charter or a compassionate, we don't have the resources, we don't have the time, that's too much, right? And people sort
Mm,
of back away from it and say, it's simply not something I can engage in. But the reality is, and the beauty of this model is, you can start this in any place, in any fashion, in any living room, right? And part of it's just about creating these spaces where people can come together and speak out loud and be witnessed in and be given a sense of belonging around these places of difficulty. And so I think that's a beautiful example. We've hosted death over dinner events of bringing people around a table and sharing, previous, present, or kind of future concerns around end of life issues, holistic advanced care planning, starting the conversation. And so I think in some ways we need to think more about, boiling this down into little pieces. Where are these conversations happening? And from there, where can there be this sort of proliferation or blossoming of potential that comes from that, versus we've got to do a compassionate city charter and then work back from that. And most people, you're going to lose people's attention or investment in some ways when you start too big. And so it's about starting at that community level and not being overly prescriptive and saying, this is what it has to look like because this is what worked in Detroit, but what is needed in your community, and who are who are the individuals, the stakeholders, what are the assets that you can really, kind of utilize in your favor to start whatever is needed locally. And so I think your example is a beautiful sort of illustration of that.
Thank you. And we were somewhat inspired, and I think when I talked with Luke, there are examples of compassionate communities evolving, emerging around the globe. And when I was talking with Luke, he said there's this extraordinary woman who's trying to do it in Oregon, and that's you. And so walk us through what the Peaceful Presence Project is. And my understanding is you sort of have a plan for what you want to accomplish. Walk us through sort of some of the things that you're thinking about how to begin to see that in your own work and community.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate Luke desiring to sort of highlight the work that we're doing in Oregon, because we're really excited about it. And we do feel like there's an element of this that, ideally can be kind of replicated around the US and beyond. We have more examples of the compassionate community model outside of the US. And we, as a US-based organization, have really challenged us to say, well, what does it look like to create examples of this here in the United States that can serve as a sort of inspiration point for others? So the Peaceful Presence Project, we founded the community-based organization. We're a nonprofit in 2019. And really, we began with creating curriculum, educational material to train individuals to the end-of-life doula skill set. So really, centering that place of death and grief literacy that we really can do intentional learning around. So we created the 75-hour training, put it online. People started taking the training in Oregon and beyond. We actually it was made live during COVID, and we found that, as we were Oregon centered and focused, but it started kind of finding tentacles and reaches beyond Oregon. And in this work, one of the things that really became evident to us very quickly is that our state is extremely rural. We've got 36 counties in Oregon, and 26 of those 36 are considered rural or frontier. What this means is that there are people living with serious and chronic illness, with end-of-life experiences, that have limited to no access to palliative and hospice care.
Okay.
So communities where people are literally living without these services. And so, we kind of did an internal and then external assessment and said, one of the major ways of sort of addressing this and kind of sort of jumping over some of these barriers to care is embedding this death and grief literacy skill set within rural communities. So we reached out to multiple foundations and have had some good luck with foundation funding to bring this training to rural Oregonians free of charge, which has been a really beautiful process. By the end of this year, we'll have trained about 65 people or so in rural Oregon, with the vision of really, creating this community-based serious illness network across the state of Oregon, where individuals who have been trained and can be available in their communities. Again, these are non-medical roles that people are playing, but if we go back to remembering that statistic that around 80% of end-of-life needs are non-medical in nature, right? And so it's about activating, creating that compassionate community ethos within these rural communities and saying, there are people here who are resourced and who are capable of coming and being with you, of doing some of that troubleshooting and planning and thinking about, what else is possible here, so you feel less isolated in this experience.
That just sounds so exciting. And walk us through what that might look like in reality, or if it's hypothetical right now. What might that trained doula or whoever might join this initiative, what might they do in that rural community?
So it's a very dynamic process in that, I think one of the realities for rural community members and professionals is that people end up wearing a variety of hats. So, just thinking to some of the people who have done the training, we had an executive director of a rural food bank who said to us, on the day to day, my job is to make sure that families are fed, that they have these, the food resources. And the reality is, people walk in our front door and say, my husband just got this really scary diagnosis and we don't know what to do about it. We don't know what's possible. We don't know where to turn. We don't know what
Right.
questions to ask. So, one simple example, a lot of people in rural environments who've done our training are clinicians that work, within primary care settings, go and do home visits and have said, I've had this experience with medical school and learning all of, the more medical based interventions, but I've never been given that very specific end of life training. And I want to be a more literate, grief and death literate resource in my role as a clinician. And so they've embedded the learnings from this training into, am I wearing my nurse hat? Am I wearing sort of still my nurse hat, but I'm pulling in some of that end of life doula skill set just to know how to accompany this person. Individuals working with community members living with disabilities and figuring out how to make sure the rights of those community members are really centered and prioritized and documented, right? That maybe we need to be asking different end of life questions for different demographics. So it depends. I think the beauty of this is that the core, the foundation of this learning is really applicable and adaptable to so many different roles that people might be playing within, a rural setting.
Yeah, that's exciting. And if someone wanted to learn more about your work or your process or how to help, how would you guide us? How would you guide that person?
Well, we have a lot of information on our website, on the Peaceful Presence Project website. And another thing I want to highlight for people who are listening or watching and wondering about, there's something about this model that's appealing to me. And yet, I get online and there's resources that are maybe focused on Asia or Canada or Australia, or, which is beautiful. I mean, and that's a part of the process that we've been doing for multiple years, is kind of bringing in resources and sort of percolating with it and saying, how does this play out in a US context? And our organization, myself and my co-director, Erin Collins, had the opportunity to come together with Dr. Karen Wyatt, who has the End of Life University podcast, and then Dr. Quinn Galloway Salazar, who is based on the East Coast in Georgia. And Quinn mostly works doulas and works with a lot of veteran communities and family members. The four of us came together and created curriculum that is a four-part curriculum series that talks about compassionate communities work and how it might, what we might be thinking about within a US context. And so that's another resource that's available on our website. There's also, it's compassionatecommunities.us that people can go to. And it's an online free learning series that really helps people just to kind of get the foundational ethos and elements of this approach, and then from there kind of take it back to your community and say, what part of this might I take and start to explore locally within my community.
Well, that's remarkable and inspiring. And the goal of the symposium was to help our audience sort of embrace all the changes that are occurring in end-of-life care. It's a dynamic time in regards to how AI will be impacting it. We've had a conversation with someone on placebos and how art. And so I'm just so excited for you to help our audience understand this model that is global in context, but also now in many ways evolving in a US context. So thank you for pointing us to resource and sort of guiding us to how to consider to apply this in our own communities.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. It's something we're excited about. We launched the compassionatecommunities.us site, and then we had a follow-up sort of town hall conversation with people who went through the four-part series. And it was really inspiring for us as the co-creators of that platform and putting that information out there, just to see the ways in which people are really hungry for these conversations and people wanting to be a part of what feels like a really necessary and innovative approach to the issues that we're confronting around aging populations and tapped out systems that can only do so much, and staffing shortages, and really helping us to rethink the myth that we don't actually have an empowered say or a role to play for one another in these spaces, right? That as things have become more medicalized, there are so many beautiful things that have come with the advancement of medical technology and involvement, right? And including, the amount of time we can live, how we live, et cetera. But I think some sort of an amnesia process in that has been not knowing or remembering the essential pieces of the relational, community-based way in which we show up in those spaces. And so I think that's, when we think about those challenges that you name or the opportunities, this model has to be a part of that conversation, I believe.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And grateful for your time, grateful for your work, grateful for you pointing us in this essential and dynamic new way to care for each other in community.
Thank you, Mark.
Great. Thanks for your time, Elizabeth. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Welcome to the last hellos, new models of global end-of-life care. My name is Mark Barger Elliott. I'm the Executive Director, the Completed Life Initiative. It's my honor and my pleasure to welcome Luc Deliens to our symposium. Luc is a renowned sociologist and professor of palliative care research. Since 2000, the founding director of the End-of-Life Care Research Group of the VUB University and Ghent University in Belgium. His research is focused on timely integration of palliative care, interprofessional models of palliative care, public health and palliative care, and medical assistance in dying. Internationally, Luc is an adjunct professor at QUT University in Brisbane, Australia, president of the Public Health Palliative Care International. He's published over 600 papers and over 50 book chapters, and has received several scientific awards for his work. Welcome, Luc, to our symposium. We're delighted you are here.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
The word compassion, as you likely know, comes from the Latin root passio, which means to suffer. And then when it's paired with the Latin prefix con, it literally means to suffer together. What does the word compassion mean to you? How would you define it? And even how have you experienced compassion in your own life?
Well, I think compassion is really being empathic for the people who are suffering, or the people who are facing loss, or for the people who are facing bereavement. And that is, I think, the true compassion comes in, and not, well, we are not generally trained in empathy. Even not doctors are not trained in empathy. So people have a certain personality and they will be very good. So hopefully most of the psychologists will be very good in empathy, but normal other professionals will not be trained really very well in empathy for others. And so I think true compassion comes with opening yourself with the other person, and meaning the other person, not the other patient. So a patient is a person with a disease. What we do in medicine right now is treating the disease. We are not caring for the patient. That's where starts for me also compassion, trying to understand what's going on with that person, not just from a biomedical point of view, but from a social and psychological point of view, trying to understand what are the real needs of that person with cancer. It's a person with cancer. It's still a full person with life expectancies, with loved ones, with work relationships, with free time relationships, with sports relationships, etc., etc. And if you want to live a full life, you have to understand the impact of a disease on that person, not just the impact of the disease on the body of that person.
So is it fair to say that the first step when you embrace the idea of compassion is to be present and to listen?
Absolutely. Yeah. Trying to understand the patient's point of view or the person's point of view. And they go through all kinds of phases in coping with the disease. When it's a serious illness, you have to cope with a potential limited life expectancy. So it's coping with all these complexities is very difficult and very different from person to person.
Yeah.
And also different from family systems, because you have to understand the family system as well. And for professionals, very often it's very difficult, and they don't have the time for doing that. So they don't have the time. So it has to come from the society. It has to come from what I call the inner circle around the person, but also the outer circle around the person. And if we succeed in educating this outer circle and the compassionate communities around people with cancer, for example, we can really create a lot of capacity for caregiving in our society. And the problem with our society is that, especially for palliative care, we have been focusing only on the professional systems of palliative care. And I think that is the drama. Also, as a sociologist, I was quite frustrated at the moment when I realized that more than 80% of the caregiving within palliative care is about social care, is about mental care for patients. And that does not need to be done by professionals. I mean, the vast majority of the caregiving in palliative care is being done by your loved ones. So there is the famous, even when you're in the hospital, there's what Alan Gallagher calls the 95% rule. And that's a very simple rule. And that overall it counts for all kind of patients. It's that less than 5% of the time, even when you're in a hospital, you will have a professional next to your bed. Less than 5% of the time. So if you stay in hospital 24/7, you have to think about who will be filling in this 95% of the time. So that is the real issue in palliative care. So most of the problems, I always ask people when I give lectures on palliative care, who is for you going to be your most important caregiver when you will be diagnosed, for example, with cancer, or when you are diagnosed with a serious illness? Who will be your most and when people, because they are in the context of a healthcare system, when professors are coming to talk to them, they think most of the people will say, my GP, so my family doctor. And I said, okay, your GP, and take the situation where you still, when you still have young children that go to school, and immediately ask them, but when you have to go to the hospital for your chemo, who's going to bring your kids to school? Who's going to take two kids back from school and helping them with their homework, with their learning, etc. So it's the same for food. So who is going to cook your meal at night? And for the meal, you need your groceries. You have to go to buy your groceries. Who is going to buy your groceries? If you have a dog and you're at the hospital, who's going to walk your dog out? twice a
Right.
day,
Right.
etc., etc. So these are all these social activities which help tremendously that person with a disease, with a serious disease. And while you're doing that, you're there for that person. You're compassionate because you're there. And you try to fill in the gaps that he or she leaves beyond because they are under treatment in the hospital.
And what I love about that is you're helping us to see both the inner circle and then the outer circle. And then the outer circle, if I understand it right, is this idea of a compassionate community that surrounds people in their time of need. And maybe you could help us understand that. I did a little bit of reading, and it feels like the concept of compassion sort of took off with Karen Armstrong's TED Talk, and then that prize, which launched the Charter for Compassion. And then, as you mentioned, Professor Kelleher's ideas of compassionate cities. Uh, can you walk us through a little bit of the evolution that took us to this idea of a compassionate community, and how it's evolved the last few years in particular?
Well, it started actually with Alan Gallagher, which is already 20 years old, his first
Yeah,
book on health promoting palliative care.
right.
And the idea in that book was very simple idea. It was actually inspired by the changes in society around health and who's responsible for our own health.
Can you help our audience? I think this is so helpful. Can you offer us a few examples of compassionate communities that you are aware of or help guide around the world? I know there's quite a few. Do any come to mind to help our audience understand what a compassionate community might look like?
Well, there's a lot. I mean, compassion community needs to be built up bottom up. So it's not something that you build up top down. Well, you can try to do that, and you can maybe also. And so it's up to the people. So actually, basically, compassionate community is identification of potential networks that can support people confronted with serious illness, caregivers, loss, bereavement. So it's really up to a local community to identify the resources in the society, in the local community, who can start up a compassionate community. Where it starts up or how it starts up, it doesn't matter. We have now very beautiful examples of compassionate community in schools. My university in Brussels has become the first international, well, European, mainland Europe, compassionate university. And what we do is we try to improve the processes both for the students and for the staff of the university who are confronted with loss and serious illness. You can do that on a school level. There's beautiful intervention materials for how to improve debt literacy at school, for example. You have to know, for example, that a secondary school pupil, which is 6 years in Belgium, I don't know how long it takes in the US, but there's more than 90% of the pupils at secondary school, when they start secondary school and when they leave secondary school, more than 90% will be confronted with the death of a closed one in their family. It might be a grandfather, it might be a grandmother, it might be a father, it might be a mother, it might be a sister or a brother. More than 90% of these kids, when they go to are being confronted with that. So that means that in your school, you're almost daily confronted with that. In a school level. And so how do we cope with that? How do we support those children who are confronted today with the death of a loved one? And so we have a lot of intervention material already developed for schools on the level of the teachers, on the level of the pupils at school, to ease the talking about it, bringing the case at school on a not threat in a way that it's not threatening for the child, but leave the place to the child to speak out what he or she wants to speak out at school. So there's models of there's very different models of compassionate communities. It can be established in a business. And we are now running out an international research project in Europe about, it's called co-work, compassionate workplaces, to try to promote more compassionate workplaces in Europe. So you can, and it's always very easy. It's always identifying the potential situations where you can support people. One, in a business, there's always people also, just like in a school, that are confronted with either becoming a caregiver for a partner who is seriously ill, confronted with cancer. So how do you cope as a workplace with this situation? How do you support that person in order that you prevent that person become ill herself or himself as well? And so that person will not return in a proper way to the workplace when you don't create the space and the room for that person to first of all to take care, and maybe when that person dies afterwards to have a normal bereavement process for that person. And it's all about creating supportive systems around a person. When I have a colleague of mine was confronted with a terminal illness of her father, I said to her, just stay at home. Don't teach here at the university. We will take over your teaching. Just take care of your father right now. You don't have to feel responsible for the next meeting. We will take over that responsibility. So it's these small things which are not put into stone in regulations in the university. Because, for example, when someone dies in Belgium, you have when a closed one dies, you have only 2 days or bereavement care or something. I mean, which is ridiculous. I mean, if you have to cope with 2 days with bereavement care and think that you will cope after 2 days of work leave, it's ridiculous. It's stupid. So we have to think more collectively in terms of how do we cope collectively with these things that happens to any one of us. It can happen to you, it can happen to me, it can happen to my neighbor, it can happen to a brother of mine, a co-worker of mine. So everyone is going through these difficult times. And it's a question of how do we as a society cope with these situations? And more importantly, how do we support these people?
Well, thank you, Luc. I find your work inspiring, and in our symposium, we're looking at new models in end-of-life care, and I think you pointed us in a fascinating and productive direction, and that is seeing the connection between palliative care and compassionate communities. And thank you for your work. Thank you for your insights, and we're grateful for your time.
Thank you for having me there in the States.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate it, Luc.
Thank you. Thank you.